Continuing on in our analysis of Herbert Schlossberg's book, Idols for Destruction, we move into the second chapter entitled Idols of Humanity. The root of the fall is not a direct worship of an external God outside of Yahweh, but rather the direct and internal worship of the self. Eve was manipulated by the serpent in the Garden of Eden to eat of the fruit of the forbidden tree, thinking that it would make her wise and like God himself. She believed the lie that humanity could be wise even in direct disobedience to God's word. So mankind in the garden mistook their own image for Yahweh himself, even though they were made in his image. They thought they could be like him without him. Specifically Eve initially. So, Eve was the first humanist. Her children followed in her footsteps towards the forbidden tree. But that is the root of humanism. Mankind denies a God outside of himself, but acknowledges the divine imprint of his own image and raises that now lifeless image to become the ultimate idol of humanism, or the worship of self. Most are unaware of the slow progression of humanism, especially through the Renaissance period and on down through the Enlightenment period. The enthronement of human reason displaced the right of God to rule man or rule over man during this time frame, though the thought was that man had rediscovered his own divine spark. This spark rekindled the flame of idolatrous human worship. The key to this worship became the displacement of divine law. Reason within man, through his experience, became the source of all understanding. And since God's law confounded the wise, or confounds the wise, even as Scripture says, and became foolishness to man in his reason, man saw fit to replace it. This became known as antinomianism, or anti-law. It sought to establish a law based on human reason apart from the divine law itself. This leads to the familiar concept as discussed in the last chapter of the sentiment of the day, being the ultimate definer of what law should be or should not be. We're going to talk about that quite a bit today. It rests itself upon the fundamental concept that, to humanists, that mankind is good in his most base form. And the key to this is the ignoring of law itself, because if there is no divine law outside of man, there is no law breaking and subsequently no sin either. Therefore, man is not tainted with sin because he's, inherently good, and there's no effects of sin, therefore. And, he's essentially, tabula rasa, a clean slate. This began in the Renaissance period and developed through the Enlightenment by John Locke and others like him. The tabula rasa, blank slate mentality leaves man open to rewrite his own destiny, creating civilization and cultures based on whatever the will chooses to etch into the mind of man. A recent etch into the slate of civilization is the Humanist Manifesto. I don't know if you knew there was one. We won't read it here, but the manifesto attributes to mankind the characteristics of deity: complete sovereignty, complete rationality, and moral perfection. Though this, of course, is not realized in its entirety in mankind at the moment, it is, with the help of technological and societal progression, inevitably going to be accomplished. The core idea behind the manifesto and its effects on society, as one of its main proponents, Aldous Huxley, said, was that the fall had become an exploded doctrine. Exploded doctrine. Think of that. Thus man had never fallen, essentially. And the serpent's words were actually true. We are gods. We have a newfound identity, as Daniel Bell has stated, and it's one of the main marks of modernity itself, which is, quote, I am, I come out of myself, and in choice and action I make myself, end quote. Welcome to the brave new world. As a sovereign, man, as already alluded to here, is able to make for himself law. And these laws, by not having any tether to a source outside of man, are completely and utterly dependent upon man himself. Though man is only the sum of his experiences, and so law develops and changes with the ever-evolving landscape of society. Good and evil are non-existent, to the extent that the definition is completely arbitrary and dependent upon the lawmaker of the current day. The words exist, yes, but the meaning behind the words do not. And so sentiment, or opinion, of the day defines the meaning of good and evil. But since there's no firm basis for that definition of good and evil, no action can essentially be judged. Humanists try to cover that gap by stating that, the motive can be evil, but not necessarily the action. Man's free to act according to his own will, unless that, of course, becomes contrary to the reigning sentiment of society at large, or the decisions of a sovereign elite. If the laws act, law itself, in principle, acts as a fence around each and every individual in a nation that both keeps himself in the bounds of that fence and also keeps others from entering in, it becomes in a sense, a protective barrier for one's neighbor and oneself. That's the fundamental function of law. The humanist conception of law is more akin to an imaginary line that is said to exist with words, but offers no real means of enforcement or protection for the individual. It's in a way dependent upon the blind faith of each individual to believe the invisible fence is there and they must trust that it will protect them only if that individual, of course, stays within the limits of the ever-changing standard of measurement. So, how far does the invisible fence extend? Who can say? Well, of course, the one who says so is the one who says and makes that measurement and standard as to how far it extends or doesn't. And so ultimately that fence it's akin to subjective law, which can be manipulated and changed at any time by the leaders or masses, depending on which way culture is moving. In a word, the foundation of humanism is feelings. Or as Schlossberg states, he says it's sadism, the elevation of feelings into a moral principle. Feelings, as a sane, rational person understands, can change on a dime. And relativism is the result of a moral system that bases its construct on mankind's emotional responses. Anything can be justified in a society of sentiments, especially if the end is good, quote unquote, right? The means can be justified even if those means are evil. When sentiment or feelings or opinion replaces law, the anything goes methodology becomes common practice. For example, if the elderly drain society of vital resources, it may be evil to kill them off, but, the end result is for the greater or common good of all. Resources have been preserved, inconvenience on the younger generations to take care of them is removed, etc. If it saves the rest of us, then this evil is justified. This is an unpredictable system of values. Common conservatives and liberals, they don't understand that, politics and political systems like democracy are unable to make this right. They can't right this fundamental flaw within thinking. It's not an issue that voting can fix. The problem's much deeper than that. And so as we start to examine the deeper problems of humanism with its hallmark ethic, pragmatism, we'll go through here some of these points of humanism. Pragmatism, we mean, is essentially the means by which someone does something based on factual understanding of the issues. Through this, the means are glorified and the ends matter not, right? Nonetheless, facts require interpretation, and those facts are consequently interpolated by the values and views of the interpreter. The values behind the methodology are always elusive and general, making those values either impotent or meaningless, and it is always, in the end, it becomes subjectivism. And that makes sense when, your values are based on feelings. The resulting subjectivism in the political sphere works its way out in imbalanced judgment, as the reasoning behind any contradictory decision in judgment, it's simply justified by either individual or collective sentiment. Whatever the broader feeling is, it can be justified if it matches that feeling. Covering words are then used to define this subjectivity, such as goodwill or even love, a very common trope used today in postmodern culture. But as Schlossberg states, others, he says, may have different masks for it, but the reality will always be the same. Subjective emotional responses are the determinants of right and wrong. Here is where law essentially becomes the expression of idolatry. Law itself, in the humanist mindset, becomes expressive idolatry. Schlossberg now breaks down a very interesting and perhaps controversial point in the face of postmodern culture here. He says, quote, if humanism is the theological arm of humanity, the ethical arm is humanitarianism, end quote. Whether Christians are aware of it or not, humanitarianism, like yoga, we won't get into that, but like yoga, is a religious term. Humanitarianism is proof of how modern language can be leveraged to attain political and even spiritual ends that are contrary to Christianity. Ironically, many Christians utilize the word to express doing good works on behalf of men. This is no doubt the common understanding today. However, the roots of the word go back to the 18th century theologians of humanism. And it's utterly opposed to its goal, that Christianity espouses for and works towards. They're not the same goal. They're not the same end. It's not so much the good works of the Spirit, rather the good works of the flesh that humanitarianism promotes. The tree of knowledge of evil also has the knowledge of good fruit on it, remember? So, herein lies its expression through humanitarianism. We travel now down the path of modern humanitarianism and the effects it has had on the world as a whole. Nietzsche reveals an ancient sin that has remained cloaked in obscurity, though humanitarianism has served to provide us with a clearer picture of this perversity hidden deep within man. That sin, and we'll mention this quite a few times here, that sin is called ressentiment. It's a transliteration of the French word, which conveys a concept similar to resentment in jealousy or envy, but runs deeper than both. In man, there exists this ressentiment, a feeling of envy towards those who want to be or towards those who you want to be, either physically, materially, socially, spiritually, or above all, maybe all those combined, essentially. Yeah, it's not simply envy that drives this ressentiment. It's the desire to destroy the one you envy by any means necessary. With ressentiment, you will see the most common outworking of this trait in the propping up of opposites in order to get to the goal of the destruction of the main object that one envies. Scheller describes it as follows, quote, the formal structure of ressentiment expression is always the same. A is affirmed, valued, and praised, not for its own intrinsic quality, but with the unverbalized intention of denying, devaluating, and denigrating B. A is played off against B, end quote. This deep-seated tactic finds expression in many forms, but it should be noted that the one who owns ressentiment in his heart is willing to suffer in order to attain his goal of harming his object of envy. He's willing to identify with the victim or even the loser, if only to bring the perpetrator or winner off the pedestal and into his own misery. Altruism is a perfect example of such an expression. With altruism, the poor, weak, and base are typically glorified in the face of the rich, strong, and powerful. Auguste Comte, the originator of the word altruism, didn't believe in self-love and thought that one could debase the strong and powerful by glorifying the weak instead. Thus, it was an attack on the strong, rich, and powerful by attacking oneself and then propping up the weak, seeking to bring the more well-off into that same state of weakness. It wasn't a form of love, though it utilized that language. It's rather a veiled form of hate towards oneself and even the one that you identify with, the poor or the weak or the base, and especially the envied object, the more well-off, the stronger. It is ressentiment. It's a concerted and formulated effort to identify with those low things in life, utilizing the excuse that you are setting the example for those who need to be brought lower themselves. This desire to level out humanity, it has a modern expression in the form of equalitarianism or egalitarianism. Equalitarianism is the desire to make man equal, not just in opportunity, but specifically in economic outcomes. So, this differs from the American Declaration that all men were created equal, where all forms of nobility and blood advantage were theoretically stripped from civilization, and men were given equal opportunity before the law to create their own station in life. Hereditary, the nobility, aristocracy no longer had a play in American society. But as Schlossberg states here brilliantly, quote, equality of opportunity guarantees inequality of results because people are unequal in motivation, ability, will, and their values are so varied that they direct their energies toward different goals. Humanitarianism, thoroughly materialistic, can measure equality only in terms of monetary gain. End quote. It's here where Schlossberg examines the economic policies in American society in the late 1970s and early 1980s when he wrote this book. And it's a worthy examination in understanding the racial issues of our own time in the 2020, and how an idolatrous point of view has served to exacerbate the tensions in our society. So it's especially relevant to what's going on today with the Black Lives Matter, Antifa, or heck, even the coronavirus. So we begin by examining the Tocqueville effect. The humanist thought process follows the logic that, as things level out, materially speaking, between the rich and the poor, the tension in society will simmer as well. And we will be that much closer to the Humanist Manifesto's utopian vision or view of the world. However, as Tocqueville examined in his analysis of the French Revolution, the exact opposite occurs. The closer a class comes to equality with the higher class, a lower class to a higher class, the greater the tension becomes. Social distinctions, when erased, exacerbate the ressentiment within man. People don't find practical envy within themselves when comparing their lot with that of, the Rockefellers or Rothschilds. That's unattainable. They know it. But show them a neighbor who has just a little more than them. That differential becomes magnified. In a sense, I've got to have what my neighbor has. I can see it. I can see they have a little more than me. I need that. Perhaps ressentiment is best expressed as essentially covetousness, and by acting upon this impulse, American society has violated the 10th commandment, maybe? Ressentiment is essentially the acting out of covetousness. Thus, humanitarians they don't seek justice for the poor. Rather, they seek the disparagement of the rich in order to bring that class down with them. How do they accomplish this fleecing of the rich in order to level the playing field, though? Here we enter into the relationship between victimhood and guilt. Humanists, being materialistic in spirit, remember that Schlossberg pointed out, it's the only way they can truly measure that leveling effect, that equality that they're seeking. They find the greatest form of victimization here is, once again, the disparity between the rich and poor. Therefore, the rich are guilty for being rich, and the poor are victims of the rich. Humanitarian theologians find justification in the broad definition of poverty that ever-changing statistical numbers support. As the standard of living rises in the modern world, obviously a new class of impoverished has, arisen to replace that old class. And therefore, these people who have been, raised just with a standard of living become those new victims of an ever wealthier rich class, essentially. Definitions are changing. Statistics change with it. So you've got to adjust your definition to meet this new poor standard. Essentially this, right? Think about it. It's not that hard, right? You just look at the poor in comparison, from the 1920s to the 2020s. There was poverty, and then there's people who, live in housing, who have TVs and, 3 square meals at least a day. There's obviously a difference, and, smartphones have changed the landscape, et cetera. So as that standard of living, once again, rises in the modern world, obviously we have to accommodate that through changing definitions. The humanists are brilliant at this. It's never about, though, keep in mind, those victims, right? New victims, new standards of poverty, new victims. It's never about getting the poor out of poverty. It's always about getting the rich to feel guilty for being rich so that redistribution of wealth can occur. And it's the guilt factor that makes this so successful. Guilt typically signifies the violation of some form of law. But remember that, humanists do not conform to a higher law outside of themselves. So, of course, this measurement of guilt varies according to the sentiment of the day. It's paradoxical, that guilt would be utilized in such a lawless environment, though. Moral sentimentality has become the system of America, replacing the biblical and constitutional framework that acted as the bedrock for the greatest innovative expansionary period in history, say from the 1812 to 1960s. This moral sentimentality has acted as the fulcrum to reach deep into the hearts of the general citizenry at any time to arouse guilt feelings in order to take wealth from them and transfer that material to whoever the current victim of the day is. Guilt is that fulcrum that reaches in, grabs it, pulls it out, and moves it to someone else. Victims, therefore, they come to rely on this handout, and they perpetuate the guilt placed on the rich in order to prolong their own victimhood, which seems to pay. The victims in this system must always remain victims, though, and become dependent on the social planners, the humanist. P.T. Bauer describes how, once again, the individual is lost in the sea of collectivism. Instead of the need of individual repentance, say, from dead works, it's, quote, collective guilt that has replaced a sense of personal sin, end quote. Just as in the historicist viewpoint that we discussed last chapter, the individual action is useless. It's only the collective and subsequently the state's action that has any meaning. If the state represents the collective means by which humanitarians accomplish their work, we will find that, the greatest evil they are collectively responsible for is poverty, or at least in their own minds. And so, this evil must be atoned for. The poor becomes the victim that needs sacrificial expiation, and the rich becomes the very trespass offering to remove that guilt. The French Revolution is a fine example of how this worked out. Here's why the definition of poverty is, completely relative, though, as Schlossberg shows, because monetary and material possessions do not define poverty. It's exampled in the impoverished example. Here, take this example. An impoverished immigrant who migrates from Europe and lives in the slums, right? They work hard. They provide for themselves, though maybe they temporarily find themselves in a situation that isn't ideal. They're seeking a way out of the slum, though. They may be slummers, one who dwells in the slum, but they're not slum people. Ultimately, it is rather culture that defines poverty rather than material attainment. And culture is the network of shared beliefs that expresses itself through institutions and relationships of the common people. The culture of the immigrants who travel and seek to the betterment of his lot it's not dependent upon anyone but himself and his family to succeed in that. The humanists say otherwise. They say the environment, the slum, and his possessions or lack thereof, keeps that immigrant, to stick with the example, within a state of poverty, and therefore both the environment and the material circumstances must be changed externally in order to create an internal difference in that immigrant. Enter the state to help that immigrant slummer out of his slumminess. The state will save the poor. Here's where the war on poverty came in the 1960s. What the war on poverty truly created was merely an exacerbation of the problem it sought to fix. It created bureaucratic policies and organizations that did not lift poor people out of the slums, but rather created more slum people who, wherever they go, would create new slums to inhabit. Why? Well, this can be attributed to one word: dependency. That immigrant who was self-reliant in his own desire to work and make a better living was independent from the state's handout. The one who becomes, within the slum, dependent fully on the state will find that they are in a whirlpool of dependency. Now think of this. Daniel Moynihan states that a sexual ethic that places a low premium on chastity and therefore has a high rate of births outside of marriage is predisposed to dependency. Now think of that. Specifically, single motherhood. It's one of the major things that plagues the poor class, and in particular the black community, many in the slums. Before the war on poverty began, over 2/3 of black households were led by a father in the 1950s. After the war on poverty, just 10 years later, over half of the black community was headed by a single mother. If the father can no longer provide for the children, then the mother must. Why wouldn't the father provide? Well, because he left. The mother is the one who now has to take care of the children, but she's got to care for the children and provide, and many times we find she needs assistance to do so. Sadly, this is where the state comes in and becomes the father of the fatherless. But how does the state provide for its children? Well, it must take from those children who are more well off to feed those who are not. This is the basis for the redistributive incentive systems that ressentiment tends to foster, Schlossberg states. When one is dependent on someone or something else for their livelihood, one tends to place the responsibility on the provider to maintain that living naturally. This is the reason for the welfare system as a whole in American society today. Since the victims of poverty must remain victims, they must also remain poor. The irony is that the humanitarian policies seeking to overcome poverty are the very reasons that the poor remain in it. Whether it be to incentivize unemployment by making it more lucrative to not work rather than go back to work and form some form of self-reliance. If you can make more money and remain in a state of leisure without lifting a finger, who would choose to break a sweat with that form of luxury? This is the source of what is known as voluntary unemployment. You could go back to work, but choose not to. But what if one, say, does choose to go back? As some do. But perhaps they're unskilled and require lower-paying jobs to at least start that process of becoming self-sufficient. The humanitarian view is that the minimum wage must, in that case, be raised in order to incentivize the voluntary unemployed people to get back to work. But they refuse to take into account the employer in this case, who now then hires fewer employees because they can't afford to pay those higher wages for less amount of work being done. Hence, we see the reason for automation nowadays to replace low-skilled jobs. As the black economist Thomas Sowell states, racism as the cause of black teenage unemployment is a red herring. The real cause is humanitarian social policy, end quote. This goes for all those on the dole who cannot wean themselves off of it. George Gilder sums it up after immersing himself in the life of the black slums of the 80s, saying, quote, high levels of welfare payments only demoralize and deprave the poor, destroying their families, draining their energies, and stultifying their lives, end quote. This is the main point. Due to independence, which became a modern creation of the welfare system itself, it's a problem particular to the United States. Though by our time, of course, it's become more widespread than just America. Social Security, like that of the welfare system for the poor, has served to disintegrate the familial structure that would have supported older people with support and companionship later in their lives. Instead, there's an epidemic of neglect and loneliness in the senior population today. The state has served to keep the victims in whatever level society can breed them in their state of victimization. It's called ontological victimhood, meaning victimhood is the result of circumstances. The victim is simply a victim in their very existence. Fate has made them so. It's always about where to place the blame. We can't blame the single mother for her state of poverty. The question as to how the baby that was birthed came into existence in the first place is disallowed. You can't ask that question. For that would be blaming the victim as if she were actually responsible for the act. All mothers, in effect, are therefore raped, essentially, single mothers specifically, in the minds of humanitarians. They're not responsible for their actions, but are merely machines that have a certain output. The input from fate, the universe, once again, that impersonal, ethereal force, leads to the expected output in the victim. The racial argument is much the same. Certain races are unable to take responsibility for themselves because that is their state of being. Black people need help from the state because systemic racism keeps them down. It's never attributed to themselves. Victimhood becomes the essence of who they are, who we are. The victims of ressentiment politics are forever oppressed by outside circumstances. Don't ask why they're in the predicament they find themselves in. That would place the blame on the victim. And remember that this is about ressentiment, and the victim's only a means to a greater end. You see, this is the mentality that truly is racist, in that there's a view towards a hereditary incapability in being able to change one's own circumstances. Never blame the individual, blame the circumstances. You are incapable of changing those circumstances yourself. Therefore, the state must do that for you. The agents of circumstances, Schlossberg states, must be made to pay, though. Thus, ressentiment successfully becomes basically, it places the unforgivable sin of success and self-reliance on the rich, or more specifically the middle class, through the usage of guilt. And as a result, the state finds justification to fleece those perceivably stronger individuals for the sake of the victimized poor. And ultimately, we see the result is equality, quote unquote. Altruism shields the weak, keeping them from becoming strong, and maintains the victim's status over those in its grasp. And so ressentiment reigns. And the policies that reign in a domestic environment apply the same on a global scale. Nations that are in poverty follow the same principles in their dependency on global institutions like, say, the UN, World Bank, IMF. These globalized organizations ensure that impoverished nations, in Africa, for example, remain not only dependent but also envious of Western culture's successes. And truly, the success point of Western society is its cultural underpinnings that Christianity has afforded it. The focus is merely upon, say, the material gain rather than the reason for the material gain. So, if there is a criticism of Western society, it's that it has left its Christian heritage for something else. The reason for the West's success is that Christianity values hard work. It's a matter of, Proverbs. It sees matter even as intrinsically good. When God made the world, he said it was very good. And that reason is a gift from God. Schlossberg states the West is not superior because of its wealth. It's wealthy because it's superior. In comparison to other cultures, such as animist cultures or even Muslim cultures, it's typically the adoption of Western principles that has led to their modern advancement and prosperity. However, with the decline of the West comes the transference of the West's own decay in those very nations that have sought to mimic the Western journey towards the setting sun. The West's successes have given rise to ressentiment on a national and international scale. And so the principles of, material economics that apply on the domestic side apply on a global scale as well. If the welfare state, or rather, I would say if the welfare from the state to the individual creates a cycle of inactive dependency, then consistent foreign aid from wealthy nations to, impoverished nations engenders the same destructive pattern. However, in the humanitarian view, it's a matter of justice, not a matter of charity, that the wealthier nations hand over their excesses to nations who are circumstantially victims. Remember, don't ask why they are poor. They just are. It is here where the humanitarians themselves find the power over those they lead. The ability to classify or define rather than judge according to the ever-evolving sentiment allows the definition of, say, for example, poor, as has been noted, to change at the stroke of a pen. The humanitarian retains the right to define right and wrong through these classifications. He doesn't have to judge, because if he did that, basically he'd have to justify his position. It's easier just to say it in a textbook or a white paper. And as Thomas Szasz put it, quote, classifying individuals, classes, nations, etc., places a lever over the heads of those classified. End quote. With the pull of the lever, then, the movers and controllers of society have the ability to influence according to the mood of the moment. This is the true purpose of the humanitarian ethic: power over the victim and the guilty. The entity who holds the lever of power in its hand is the state. By maintaining control over the victims, entire races have been kept in enslavement through incentivized policies of dependency. Sadly, the black community, as Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams have pointed out, have subjugated themselves to that humanitarian paternalism, the fatherhood of the state, which suggests that, say, blacks are incapable of spiritual development, which leads to learning, work, production. It leads to the betterment of their own families and communities. This humanitarian ethic is a false form of love for the poor. Christian love does not romanticize the poor in comparison, but it does seek to help it. It also seeks to provide the poor with the means to bring themselves out of that state of poverty into the richness of the kingdom of God and Spirit. However, the onus is placed on the individual in their relationship with God, not the one helping. The humanitarian form of love is a veiled form of hate, which only utilizes the meek and poor as a tool to gain control over the strong and rich. It must be remembered that the basis of this thought is founded in materialism, which is the denial of the existence of the immaterial. Love in their minds is measured, therefore, by material existence, nothing more, nothing less. Schlossberg now leads to the second contradiction that humanitarians hold to that is completely opposed to Christianity, the use or the issue of life and death. Ironically, humanists thoroughly appreciate the Christian ethic and all that it brings with it. It works in their mind. And so they like to believe that they could simply borrow the ethic of Christianity or the way of life and discard the God who provides the very essence to live that life which they envy. It's like viewing a man's life externally and appreciating all that he has and possesses, right? He's got a wonderful job, family, character even, but mind you, he's a Christian. So the humanist power elite, the scientific priesthood, let's say they seek to clone that man and his body in a lab, and as an experiment, they provide that clone with the same environment to live his life through as the man they modeled him after. Same job, same measure of wealth, same maybe beautiful family even. However, what they'll quickly discover is that clone might look similar in body, but the character of the model man is not clonable. The essence of life for the Christian comes from another realm, a source entirely outside of man himself. It's not something that can just be reproduced in a lab or through general circumstances or even the adjustments of material existence, rather becoming more rich or more poor. The end result of such an experiment for the clone, of course, is death, the same as any man. The Christian man's end, however, is different. His is life through death. Humanism is, in practicality, a religion of death. It glorifies death in a perverted and twisted way. Essentially, humanism is always seeking the best way to die, in fact. It doesn't have an expectation of an afterlife. Therefore, YOLO, you only live once mentality reigns. And so, if that's a cloned man, maybe that cloned man did live a fine life. He produced for the greater good. Perhaps he was worthy of a good death, the one he died. Or perhaps he wasn't. Who determines the qualification for good and bad? Well, of course, the intellectuals, the elite, the ones who hold the power over knowledge and production, specifically the state and its rulers. If the state and those who represent it determine that, say, a certain classification of life is qualified to live, then law and legislation tends to follow that mindset. This is exemplified in the value that humanists, say, place on the most fragile forms of human life, infants and the elderly. You see, abortion and euthanasia in American society was typically framed in the past within the argument of, it was mercy for the invalid himself or the handicapped, whether physical or mental. If they cannot live a good life, why live at all? If they lived a good life but now they deteriorate and decay slowly. Why suck up all the resources of the useful, productive lives to keep them living? Why not speed the process up? That decay, let's let them decay unto death quicker. And who's to say those infants and elderly are human anyway? According to the classifiers, if they don't have the ability for self-consciousness, they simply are lumps of cells and are worthy of at least the consideration of disposal. The lever is set over the heads of the most vulnerable in society. It's truly a long way from the Christian moral view of the world when it's considered a mercy to kill for the sake of convenience or inconvenience to the living. Watson and Crick, the Nobel Prize winners who discovered the structure, the double helix of DNA, obviously did not see the signature of God written in its code, as they, both discarded the value of human life, calling for, a new ethical system that allowed for infanticide, that is the killing of a child, up to 3 days after birth, in order to give parents time to consider if they truly wanted the child. They also wanted the mandatory death of anyone over the age of 80. Nobel Prize winners. Makes one question the value of such a prize, just as the prize winners themselves questioned the value of human life. Human life, though, in a Christian's view, is a prize. Moreover, it's a gift. And death is not seen as a friend to be made, but it's an enemy. In fact, it is the last enemy to be destroyed in the book of Revelation. Humanists seek the most comfortable death, for that, in their minds, is the end of the line. For a Christian, as Schlossberg says, the only comfort we take in death is the promise of resurrection. The foundation of that prospect of resurrection is love. And that love is granted in the face of sin, which is the source of the very death that humanists so desperately dread to meet, yet embrace with open arms. And so they seek to meet that death, these humanists, as humanly as possible, by co-opting Christian speak, if you will, within their lives. They utilize the terms love and charity and others as means to justify any action born out of sentimentality. But God is love. Love is not God. God is love. To have love without God is the epitome of irrationality, which then utilizes that ever-changing standard to define what love is. God's law defines the manifestation of his love in the affairs of man. But as man elevates himself to the status of godhood, he makes himself the arbiter of what love is. He becomes his own lawgiver and defines that law according to the same diet that man ate long ago in the garden, the diet of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. It brings with it the law of unintended consequences. Adam and Eve certainly suffered indigestion, no doubt, but their children, they experienced the fuller outworking of their parents' action. Finding themselves powerless to escape death, they sought to live their best life now, to make the best of their own lot in life according to the way they saw best fit. Man thought he could save himself from the shame of disobedience by the works of his own hand, exampled in the aprons of fig leaves that our first parents made for themselves to cover their shame. It was their knee-jerk reaction in response to the first of many mistakes that would be made. This was the first humanitarian act. And humanitarianism is simply the expression, it's the expression of such saviorhood, that decides the fate of man on whim and fancy. Schlossberg ends his dissertation on humanism with the following words. Quote, "The theology that divinizes man turns out only divinizes some men. The object of humanitarian concern become less than men, so that the humanitarian can exercise the prerogatives of a god. The God that failed is man." End quote. You see, we're the children of failed gods. Humanity has failed in managing its own affairs. Perhaps it's time we return to the God who knows what he is doing and stop trusting in our own efforts to save us. Perhaps we should resist the ressentiment built up in our hearts towards our neighbor and start actually loving our neighbor as we love ourselves. Wouldn't that make us truly equal if we chose to love the God of the universe and his Son, Jesus Christ, who died and rose in resurrection life for all of us equally? Instead, man hates God and chooses to love himself in his place. Love of self, is that not truly the root of it all? You know, the greatest idol that needs to be destroyed stares at you in the mirror. If you can break that stare and look away from yourself, you might see the lever over your head and break yourself away from its controller's power. Refuse the title of victim and become an overcomer of yourself. That is how the idol of humanity is destroyed. Not the destruction of man himself, but rather the subjection of man to his Creator and his Son, and not the humanist who denies him.